Hello and welcome to another GDIT Perspectives. I'm Tim Gilday, Senior Director of Emerging Technology. We're very happy to have with us today Mike Wagner, Senior Director and Biometrics Expert at GDIT. Mike, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So first, could you give our audience a little bit of your own background and some of your credentials?
Sure. So I've worked in the field of biometrics for about 16 years, mainly in support of immigration with our clients. Done some traveling. Mostly of the support was here in the Washington, D.C. area, but did do a deployment down to Mexico City and lived in Mexico City for 3 years. Moved the whole family down there, so it was a great experience, but really had a lot of exposure through how biometrics are used in the U.S. government.
Yeah, the whole spectrum I've heard. So without further ado, I guess it would be helpful for everybody to understand what is the actual definition of biometrics and what falls under that big umbrella.
Sure. So the scientific definition of biometrics are characteristics of a person that can be used to uniquely identify them. So, traditionally, what everyone thinks of in terms of biometrics are fingerprints and how those fingerprints can be used to uniquely identify you. So it's actually fingerprint technology, or fingerprint matching and identification has actually been around for almost 100 years. It started a long time ago in India when the British needed to come up with a way to help identify all the folks that were living in India at the time. So it's been a lot of maturing of the technology since then, biometrics can be used in a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of different modalities, which is the term of there's different characteristics that can be used. So face, iris, which is always a lot of times mistaken, confused with retina. And the retina is like in the movies, and you see people come in and do a scan, but that's actually measuring the blood vessels in the back of your eye, where iris is looking at identifying using the characteristics of your colored ring around your pupil.
Okay. Oh, so it's going to be a little bit harder to spoof that, right? Can you talk about spoofing and how realistic that is in the modern era of biometrics?
Sure. Spoofing. There's a lot of work that's done with the technology vendors that provide the capture devices for biometrics to prevent and to combat the spoofing. It's a little bit of a cat and mouse game. Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned, the iris in the front, if you use a contact lens, there's colored contact lens, there's patterns. With the original iris devices, they would be tricked into thinking that's not the same person if you had those patterned or those colored contacts in. So the technology vendors, took that challenge, played that little cat and mouse game, and then came up with ways to identify the patterns of those contacts. And now you can't spoof and trick an iris camera with those contact lenses. Very nice. Or it's much more difficult. I shouldn't say you can't.
Sure, nothing's impossible, but
right.
I'm glad that we're at that level of protection. So in general, why is biometrics important to us, and specifically, why is it important to the U.S. government?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So biometrics is a great tool that the U.S. government can use to positively identify someone, and it's used a lot also for interoperability, for data sharing. So I know we all have social security numbers and we all have names and addresses. Biometrics is a much more sophisticated way to identify yourself than just saying, yes, here's Mike Wagner, here's who I claim to be, and here's my social security number, right? That, it's, if you attach that, and, it's another way to look at it is with cybersecurity, right? And how, we all have used passwords to get in, and there's kind of the spectrum of, what a password, and then the next layer of security on top of that is what you have, a token or your smartphone, an app on your smartphone, and then along that spectrum, the final, who you are, right? What what you have, and who you are. So biometrics is another. It's the future kind of evolution of that way to identify you and to say, yes, this is Mike Wagner. This is the Mike Wagner that I'm interfacing with, whether it's to get a benefit, whether to enter the country, whether it's through law enforcement. Those are the kind of interactions that the U.S. government's interested in.
Okay. So actually, I remember recently I did have the good fortune to take a tour through our impressive GDIT Identity and Biometrics Lab. I was excited by a lot of the stuff in there. The nerd in me came out. But can you tell us officially what's the purpose of this lab? What are you trying to achieve there?
Sure, absolutely. So in the Identity and Biometrics Lab, so we really are focused on trying to understand, at GDIT we're big on our customers' needs and mission, understanding what the problems and issues our customers have, and then going to technology providers and understanding what they can offer, what solutions they can offer, and then working together kind of with, okay, what's the problem we're trying to solve, and what innovations we can bring from the technology providers that haven't really tailored their solutions right to the actual mission needs, coming up with new ideas, coming up with new innovations, and prototyping and proofing them out. Then we work with our customers, come in and show and demonstrate those new innovations.
Yeah, I've seen some very fancy new custom solutions being made. Could you actually give us a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the examples of what you're working on there?
Yeah, sure, Tim. Let's start with the future badgeless world. So we've been working with a technology provider, a vendor, lent us some cameras, some kiosks, similar to if folks have seen at the airports the facial recognition kiosks for boarding check-in and boarding a plane, using those kiosks to provide a badgeless entry to say, yes, I know who my employees are, I know who's authorized to enter this lab. You'd be able to walk up without a badge, just present your face and stand in front of it for a quick second, and it can identify you, say, yes, this is Mike Wagner, and he is authorized to enter, and the door opens. So we're working on that technology. We're also working on ways to help facilitate biometric fusion and interoperability with the U.S. government. So that's back to those modalities, those different ways you can do biometric identification. There's pros and cons around that, right? So fingerprints and iris can scale very largely, right? But fingerprints is kind of the gold standard in terms of accuracy and establishing an identity. And then if you layer on multiple other modalities with that established fingerprint identity, so a face, an iris, you can use those other modalities in situations and use cases that are more appropriate. So like contactless interaction, being able to, in the world of COVID, we want to move in a way where we don't have to touch everything, right? There's, much more vigilance around preventing virus in standing back 6 feet. So how can we help facilitate interactions, biometric identifications by using contactless capture? That's where facial recognition comes in. That's where iris matching comes in. And so fusing those technologies together, helping facilitate ecosystems that enable that is really what we're trying to do in the lab.
That's interesting about COVID accelerating and pushing the boundaries on biometrics technology. I was going to ask you your thoughts on future trends anyway. So could you paint the bigger picture of where you see the biometrics industry going, especially as accelerated by COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked a little bit about how the government interactions and how we can use, or the U.S. government can use biometrics to help uniquely identify someone and say, yes, this is the individual I'm trying to interact with and have that secure interaction and that trusted interaction. And that kind of gets into more of how biometrics are used in the commercial side. And, there's facial recognition in Facebook and how, you can detect, in your photos, is this you or is this your friend? More in terms of the security and the privacy and security, it exists on a spectrum, right? And so how biometrics are used in that, and we talked a little bit earlier about that, what you know, what you have, who you are, kind of, that's really where I see biometrics being used in that chain of authentication and identification, and how how we can securely, without compromising, our principles and around privacy, securely interact in a cyber world.
Right, that's critical today, and that's the main goal of most of our projects anyway. So you kind of broached it already. I wanted to understand a little bit more deeply the challenges and some recommendations in actually implementing all this different type of biometric technology and then extracting the maximum benefits from that technology.
Sure. So we touched briefly around some of around COVID and how the biometrics has been a very not a contactless kind of activity interaction. But there are other challenges, and a lot of it kind of stems from kind of the movies and and literature, and no one wants to live in a mass surveillance 1984 kind of world, right? And so and there's other kind of interactions and other uses of biometrics in other countries around the world that are on that that use that approach, right? And it's a passive collection, and people aren't interacting and expecting their face to be used, to recorded and used for an identification. And that's not what the U.S. government does, and that's not what the U.S. government is interested in. They're interested in a much more an approach where biometrics are used for an opt-in model. So you're interacting with the government and you say, yes, I'm authorizing my biometrics to be used because I would like a more secure interaction.
So you're getting that improved convenience when you opt in to obtain their services through that mechanism.
Right.
Okay. So we've talked about a lot of different terminologies, technical concepts, and even considerations on the privacy and data protection spectrum. So if you were to boil it down, what are some of the key takeaways that you would leave our audience with today?
Yeah, I think it's really important to talk about the data protection and in terms of biometrics. I think, as GDIT employees, we're all trained every year around PII and personal identifiable information and how critically important that is to protect. Your name, your social security number, your address. Well, with biometrics, your fingerprint doesn't change. And so it's actually termed not just PII, it's super PII. It has, even stronger safeguards and protections need to be in place when you're dealing with biometrics because it's so critically important that that data doesn't get compromised. And it's very, it's very important when we're dealing with the work we do and the integrations we provide and the support we give to the U.S. government that we are very vigilant around protecting biometric data.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't make a plug for one of my favorite concepts, zero trust. And multi-factor authentication and biometrics, they play a big part in that. Before we leave today, could you talk about biometrics' role in the bigger zero trust picture?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim. So biometrics, it's very important. It's a great emerging technology. There's a lot of advances going on, but it's not, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not, it's not an answer to all the problems, a lot of the issues or the solution to the bigger remote identification. How can I interact, with a U.S. government or in a trusted way with just my face? And so it's a part of that larger mosaic of multi-factor authentication, biometrics, zero trust. There's a lot of technologies that can play well together there that are complementary, and we have to make sure that we as integrators understand all of the different pros and cons of the different technologies and that we have the right solution drawing on the strengths of all those different technologies. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure our cybersecurity team will be very happy to hear that. But Mike Wagner, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to thank you all for being here with us.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me.